What do you feel when those who promise to love you betray you? This is the story of a German shepherd who knew what love and care were, but one day found herself forgotten. Going on a walk with the family, she could not have imagined that by the end of the day she would be left by the side of the road, in the cold and loneliness. But sometimes fate hides unexpected meetings around every corner. All you need is to believe in a miracle. When the German shepherd first appeared in this family's home, her arrival was a real event. The children were overjoyed, their eyes sparkling with excitement when they saw the little puppy. She was still very young, with soft, shiny fur and large, curious eyes. She shyly explored the new surroundings, feeling a little uncertain, but at the same time hoping that this place would become her home. Every rustle, every new sound scared her, but she knew she would be safe here. The family, in turn, was happy to have her. The children, smiling, blocked each other's way to be the first to approach the dog, pet her, and play with her. The man and woman exchanged looks, not hiding their joy and slight anxiety. This was something new for everyone. Caring for the dog, training, daily walks, they were ready to take on this responsibility. Right on the first day, they promised themselves that their love for this animal would be unwavering, that they would never let her feel forgotten and alone. The dog quickly adapted. She felt the love radiating from all the family members and responded with the same sincere devotion. They had a small garden by the house where she would run, playing with the children and enjoying every minute. She especially loved the morning runs in the park when the little one would lead her, and the older brother would quietly encourage her every step of the way. They took their little walks in a place full of smells and new life. Mom and Dad always tried to be nearby, laughing, sharing moments of happiness. In those moments, the dog felt loved, felt that her life had meaning. She felt how her little paws ran lightly and confidently on the ground, enjoying her freedom. The family was her world. In winter, her favorite pastime was walking on snowy paths, where the children often threw snowballs and invited her to bring them back. Mom and Dad also kept up, and together they built snow forts and rode sleds. In those moments, everything felt real. Every evening, when the whole family gathered in the house, they would have a cozy evening by the fireplace. The dog would always settle next to the children, lying near them on the soft carpet. Feeling the warmth and coziness of that moment, she would peacefully and happily close her eyes. No worries, no uncertainty, only family, love, and affection. Her place was next to them, and she had no doubt about that. But over time, something changed. At first, it was small details that no one noticed. The children started spending more time with their friends, coming home less often to play with the dog. The parents, in turn, became more absorbed in their own affairs. Dad returned from work tired, his attention consumed by projects and office matters. Mom spent more time with household chores, paying less attention to the dog. At first, this didn't bother the pet. She continued to wait in her corner for their attention, hoping to receive even a small part of the emotions they once gave her. But with each passing day, the dog felt the emptiness growing. The family's busyness prevented them from finding time to play or spend time with the pet, even for a few minutes. One day, the dog sat by the door, hoping that at least this time they would invite her to go for a walk. But no one noticed her. The children were happily noisy, engrossed in their gadgets and friends, and the parents, absorbed in their work, didn't notice her presence. When silence filled the house, the dog began to feel loneliness. She couldn't understand why. Just recently her life had been filled with noise, games, and care. But now everything had changed. There were no more walks in the park, no games with the children, no more kind words she loved to hear. She was left alone, looking out the window when the family went out for the weekend or to the store, but they never invited her along. These moments lasted for weeks. The family showed no interest, and her place in the house became more and more empty. The dog tried to get their attention, getting closer, but she was ignored. When she approached the children, they would pet her with a smile and then return to their activities. The look in the dog's eyes, full of questions, didn't go unnoticed, but still received no answer. She felt how her significance faded. She had once been the center of their attention, but now her place was somewhere in the background. Time passed, and the dog continued to try as best as she could to get some kind of sign from her family. She licked their hands, tried to turn toward each family member, following them around the house, but the responses became less frequent. Sometimes when the dog tried to look into the children's eyes, they would smile and look away, continuing to play. The parents, discussing something between themselves, didn't pay attention to her. Even when she approached them with a wagging tail, waiting for praise, she was left unanswered. One day, after the usual evening routine, the dog lay by the door, watching the family warmth that had now become foreign to her. It was a winter morning when the family gathered in the car. The dog noticed how they got in and drove away without a word, without a glance at her. She sat there, unable to believe that their trip would be without her. Mentally, she tried to understand what had happened, why they no longer called her, but nothing changed. She felt the growing loneliness and cold, no matter how much she tried to calm herself. It was a strange and frightening feeling that made her chest heavy. The dog couldn't understand what was happening. She, as always, sat in the corner by the door, ready to greet the family with joy. But no one came anymore to pet her or take her along, and as soon as the family returned home, her life seemed to have become completely empty. With each passing day, it became more and more obvious that the dog no longer held the same importance in the house. Everything happened so gradually that she couldn't immediately understand that her place in the family had become unnecessary. A few months ago, she had been the center of attention, the pride of the house, the beloved creature who was always at the heart of everything. But now, everything had changed. Everything she knew and what had brought her joy started to disappear. At first, it was small things that went unnoticed. The children started spending more and more time with their friends. They returned home late, often forgetting that they had promised to walk with her. They could no longer pass by her without calling her for a walk or playing with her, but now they simply walked past as if she were invisible. Sometimes the dog would try to run up to them to remind them of her, wagging her tail, but they became more and more focused on their own activities, ignoring her presence. Mom and Dad also became less attentive. They were not angry or cold, but their lives had been consumed by work and household chores. From morning to night, they were busy. Phone calls, meetings, visits, shopping. The family became divided into their little worlds, and the dog was left aside. When she ran up to Dad, he would pet her for a few seconds and then dive back into his work. He continued working, and she, as before, sat nearby, hoping that his attention would at least briefly turn to her. But it didn't happen. Mom also spent more time in the kitchen, busy with housework. The dog saw her less and less. Previously, when Mom would cook dinner, she would always give her a piece, sometimes even enjoying watching the dog learn new tricks. But now Mom's kitchen had become just part of the routine, and the dog saw her less and less, and when she did, it was usually without excitement. Mom would sometimes pet her, but so quickly that the dog couldn't even realize that she had been noticed. Every evening, when the family gathered for dinner, the dog would sit by the table, hoping that at least during this family moment she would again be the center of attention. But the children were absorbed in each other, and the parents, into their own matters. She sat quietly, waiting for at least someone to acknowledge her. But responses became rarer, and her place at the table more and more empty. She started to notice how, on rare occasions, they would discuss her behavior, but these talks were more about her bad habits or need for space. Her presence, once so important, had now become more of a burden than a joy. The dog felt her world narrowing. When she used to run into a room to greet Mom or Dad, or run up to the children, she was met with joy and affection. But now she was ignored. There were moments when the dog would stand at the door of the room and watch carefully as the children prepared to go outside or with friends, and they didn't even notice her. She had always been the first they called on such occasions, but now she had become part of the background. The children no longer called her for walks, and when they left, the dog remained alone, staring at the closed door, feeling her loneliness becoming more and more evident. Mornings were especially hard for the dog. When the family got up and began their morning routines, she would approach each of them, hoping that at least someone would notice her and invite her for a walk or to play. But she only received a quick pet, which was more of a formality than an expression of love. At first, she just waited, not understanding what was happening. Over time, it became clear that her presence no longer brought joy to the family. In those moments, the dog felt confused and lonely. She couldn't understand why everything had changed. Her world, which had once had meaning and a place, now seemed gray and empty. The affection and care she had once received were now taken away. She no longer knew what to do, where to go to regain the closeness she once had. Each day became more and more burdensome. Dogs may not understand human words, but they feel changes. She felt the silence that had fallen over the house. There was no more laughter, no more familiar words, no more of the warmth that had once filled her days. She started to worry. She tried to get attention in different ways. Running to the door, wagging her tail, trying to bring a toy, or simply sitting next to them. But she was ignored. Sometimes she felt like she was being called, but not truly, just because it was expected. One day, when the house was once again silent, the dog didn't dare enter the living room. She sat in the hallway watching how the children were absorbed in their phones, and the parents were talking about something trivial. The feeling of distance became new and frightening for her. It felt like everything she had once loved was fading. Something inside her was breaking, and she couldn't understand why her world no longer seemed as bright as before. The dog had long felt that her place in the family was no longer the same as before. She didn't understand exactly what had happened, but with each passing day, her loneliness became more and more apparent. But at some point, everything changed. These weren't just small details that could be ignored. This was something significant, something that couldn't be missed, even if it seemed strange and unpleasant. One winter evening, when everything in the house was still empty and quiet, Mom and Dad, sitting at dinner, began talking about what to do with the dog. At first, these conversations were invisible to the dog, as if she hadn't heard them, but gradually her attention was drawn to what they were saying. They were talking about leaving her outside in some suitable place for that. At that moment, the dog didn't understand what they were talking about, but she felt something inside her heart break. The dog couldn't understand why these words came at this moment, when she sat at the parents' feet, waiting for warmth, something familiar, something that could bring back the feeling of home. She sat quietly, looking at them, waiting for something pleasant to be said. But instead, she heard talk about putting her somewhere. Why? Why? She couldn't understand. It was like a lightning strike that shattered the silence. Day by day, the dog noticed more and more how family conversations began to revolve around her presence, but not with love. She increasingly heard mentions that she would be given away or thrown out. It was frightening, cold, and completely incomprehensible. She had once been proud to belong to this family, but now her presence had become a burden, and the words, "leave her," became a regular topic of discussion. She couldn't understand what had happened, but she felt the growing alienation. What was wrong with her? Why didn't anyone need her anymore? Why had these people who had spent so much time with her suddenly decided to leave her behind? When the day of her abandonment arrived, the dog felt that something was wrong. The family gathered in the car, and she was noticed less and less. She tried to approach as usual, wagging her tail, ready to follow them, but no one paid attention to her. They got into the car, and the door slammed shut with a crunch, as if closing a whole world where she had once been necessary. She stood at the door, watching the people leave. Her heart beat faster, and her eyes became wet. She didn't know what was happening, but deep inside, she felt that her life would change again. She watched as the car slowly moved away, leaving her behind, and she couldn't do anything to stop them. Not receiving an answer to her silent question, she stood at the doorstep, feeling as if emptiness was closing in on her. When the car stopped at the empty roadside, the dog felt her inner world collapse. She didn't understand what was happening, but she instinctively knew that this was the end. It was like a long-awaited, yet terrifying moment when they left her, and the world she had been a part of for so long became foreign. The car stopped, and the family members got out. The dog stood nearby, not knowing what to do or what awaited her. They didn't look back. One of the family members, without saying a word, picked up a piece of cardboard from the ground and carefully placed it on the ground next to the dog. On the cardboard was a simple but dreadful message. "Take her." The words on the cardboard were grim and inhumane, as if sending her into a world where she wasn't wanted. These words hung in the air, a reminder of betrayal. The dog sat on the roadside, unable to move. Her gaze was empty, but deep inside, something screamed that this wasn't right. She trembled from the cold that quickly seeped into her bones. Everything she knew was tied to that house, to these people, to those moments of happiness that had now become a thing of the past. She couldn't understand what had gone wrong, why they had left her here, on the cold and lifeless earth. It seemed as if everything she had once loved had been destroyed in an instant. The winter that day was particularly harsh. The wind howled, the snow fell to the ground, covering it with a white layer. Everything was so quiet, so empty. The dog sat, her head lowered, her fur slowly becoming covered with frost. She felt her heart growing heavier, as each minute of loneliness crashed down on her. It was cold and unbearably lonely. In her mind, there was only one question. Why was she here? Why had they left her? It was as if there was nothing that could bring her back to the world where she was loved. When they left her on the roadside, the dog began to freeze. The winter wind tore at her soul even more, and at that moment she felt that she could no longer return to her former life. Dogs don't know how to speak, but they feel betrayal. Dogs don't understand what's happening in the world around them, but they know they've been left behind. Quietly trembling on the cardboard, the dog began to believe that no one would ever love her again. When the dog was left by the roadside, her world became empty and cold. At the moment, she was abandoned. Everything she had once known turned to dust, and only the cold, cruel reality remained. The wind relentlessly struck her face. The snow filled her eyes and ears. But the worst part wasn't this. The worst part was that she was alone, forgotten, unwanted. The dog sat on the cardboard as if unable to move. Her paws had gone numb from the cold, and she could feel the icy weight spreading through her body. Every cell of her body seemed soaked in cold. And not just physical cold. The cold was in her heart, in her soul, which still hadn't understood how she could have been betrayed by those she loved so much. She tried to remember how it used to be, when the house was warm, when she ran around the yard, played with the children, and always felt needed. Now she couldn't even get up, couldn't understand what to do or how to be. It seemed that everything in the world was against her. The snow, the wind, the emptiness, all these things had become her enemies. The feeling of betrayal tormented her. How could this happen? How could it be that she, who was the center of this home, was now left outside, amidst snow and cold? Why had they left her here? Why didn't they come back? The wind continued to howl, and the dog dug deeper into the cardboard, trying to shield herself even a little from the icy gusts. But she was still cold, and she couldn't warm up. With each passing minute, it only got worse. A cold was burning in her chest, piercing her through. She lay there, thinking about how everything had changed in such a short time. At first, she was loved, needed, her life was full of joy and care, but now she was just an unwanted dog, left by the side of the road, in the middle of the cold, grim winter landscape. The dog tried to close her eyes, but she couldn't forget. Every movement she made, every attempt to get up or move, brought only new agony. Her frozen paws, the joints aching from pain, and the cold air filling her lungs, all reminded her that her life, as she knew it, was over. She felt her body weakening, but even worse was that her soul was losing strength too. It seemed she had already come to terms with the fact that she had been left behind. Someone, maybe, would take her someday, but it didn't make it any easier. Loneliness consumed her entirely, and the dog no longer believed that anyone would love her again. She had accepted that she was alone. Now her world had become only empty and icy. Time dragged on painfully slowly. The dog lay in the snow, her gaze fixed on the emptiness, seeing nothing around her. People passed by, cars drove past, but no one stopped. No one saw her, no one knew that she had once been a part of someone's life. She couldn't understand why she had been left here, why her family hadn't returned. Dogs don't ask questions. They simply feel pain and emptiness. And now, pain was everywhere. Pain was in every movement, in every breath. With each hour she grew weaker, her eyes closed more often, and it seemed that soon she would stop feeling anything at all. When the wind grew stronger, the dog squinted her eyes and pulled her paws under her to try and protect herself from the cold. She knew that time was against her, that every moment here was a step toward her end. At some point she felt her body stiffen completely from the cold. Even if someone passed by, she couldn't get up and ask for help. Everything around her had become uniform, gray and cold. In this world, there was no longer any place for her. But still, despite everything that was happening, deep in her heart, a faint spark of hope remained. This hope wasn't for salvation, but for the return of her former life. But it was fading with each passing moment. The dog couldn't explain to herself what had happened, why her life had turned into such darkness. But she clearly felt that the love she had once known was lost forever. Now, in this cold world, there was no place for her to be needed again. The dog had come to terms with the fact that her life would change. She no longer sought explanations. All she wanted was warmth, even just a few moments of peace. But beyond her thoughts, there was only emptiness. This emptiness and coldness surrounded her. When the dog had almost lost all hope, her world suddenly filled with an entirely unexpected sound. Quietly, almost unnoticed, through the storm that was hitting her, she heard footsteps. It was strange because she hadn't expected to see anyone in this desolate place. On the roadside, surrounded by winter's cold and darkness, it seemed like the whole world had disappeared, leaving her alone. But someone was walking through the snow. The dog lifted her head, trying to see who it was, but her tired eyes couldn't clearly distinguish the figure approaching through the snowstorm. The person came closer and then stopped right beside her. It was a young man, probably in his 20s. He wore a warm jacket with a hood that shielded his gaze. He wasn't rushing, wasn't hurried, but his movements were confident and decisive. He didn't look surprised, as if he knew exactly where he needed to be. Shivering from the cold, the dog tried to get up, but her body didn't obey. She was so weak that her legs buckled, and she sank back down to the ground. The young man noticed this and stopped, kneeling down beside her. His gaze was soft, calm, and in that look there was neither judgment nor irritation, only care and a desire to help. He didn't speak, but his eyes said everything. He knew what to do. He reached out to her and gently stroked her head, and the dog felt a gentle warmth spread from that touch. In that moment, her heart, which had been filled with cold and loneliness, felt a spark of warmth. Her body, weakened from long exposure to the outdoors, finally began to feel some relief. Dogs can't express gratitude in words, but they can feel it more deeply than anyone. The dog lifted her eyes and looked at him, her gaze becoming calmer, though there was still some anxiety in it. Someone had come to help her. Someone had shown care again. It was a miracle she hadn't expected. Seeing that the dog couldn't stand up, the young man took off his jacket and covered her with it. He carefully placed her back on the cardboard where she had been sitting, trying to warm her up. He knew that it wasn't enough just to approach. He needed to truly help. He felt that this dog had been through something terrible, and now he needed to give her at least some of the warmth she so desperately needed. After covering her with his jacket, the young man stood up and looked around, trying to find a place where she could warm up. He approached his car, which was parked nearby, and opened the trunk, pulling out a blanket and a few spare warm clothes. He knew he had to act quickly. Taking her and getting her off the roadside was the only right decision because in these conditions, the dog couldn't stay long. But as much as he wanted to help her right then and there, he understood that he had to act. He carefully lifted the dog into his arms, stroked her as if saying that she was safe, and placed her in his car. Inside the car, the dog felt even more warmth. She curled up on the seat, trying to warm herself. The young man closed the door and started the car. The cabin was quiet, and only the rustling of the snow against the window disturbed the silence. He drove along the empty road, glancing at the dog from time to make sure she was okay. She didn't know where they were going, but she felt that now she wasn't alone. She was with him, and at that moment, that was more important than anything. When they reached the nearest house, the young man opened the door and carefully took the dog out of the car. He knew she needed a place where she could recover. He placed her on a soft rug next to a heater, covering her with a warm blanket. In that moment, the dog felt safe, as if she had returned home. She might not have understood what had happened, but she knew for sure that she was now in the hands of a person who cared for her. The young man made sure to give her water and some food. At first, the dog couldn't eat, but soon she started to try, feeling her strength return. She was no longer the lonely and forgotten creature left on the cold street. This young man had become her savior, and despite not knowing what would happen next, her life had regained meaning. In his care, she felt that she hadn't been forgotten, that she wasn't nothing or no one. The evening became warm and cozy. The dog lay on the soft rug, warming up and recovering her strength. The young man sat quietly next to her, giving her time to adjust to the new surroundings. In his eyes was kindness, and in his heart a desire to help. It was a moment when the dog realized that she wasn't alone, that there was someone ready to care for her. With every breath, she began to feel better. Everything was new, but now, despite the cold, the betrayal, and the loneliness, she felt that her life could begin to change for the better. The dog woke up, feeling warmth around her. She couldn't understand how much time had passed since she was left on the roadside, covered in snow, thinking her life was over. Now her body was warm, and the air around her was soft and pleasant. There was no more biting wind, no more feeling of abandonment. Everything around her was filled with comfort and care, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The young man sat beside her, watching as the dog gradually recovered. He gently stroked her, feeling how, despite everything she had been through, she was beginning to relax. There was no fear or worry in his eyes. He was simply there, ready to help. He knew that for a dog who had endured so much pain and loneliness, it would take time to believe in love and care again. But he was ready to give her as much time as she needed. He was determined to help her start a new life. With each passing day, the dog grew more confident in her new place. She began to get used to the young man's home, his care, and the small joys that came with the new habits she was forming. The young man tried to make her life as comfortable as possible. Every day he took her on short walks in the park, giving her the opportunity to rediscover the world. At first, the dog felt a little unsure, but with each new step in the familiar yet now safe world, she became more confident. She began to joyfully run after the ball, playing with the young man as she had once played with the children. The world was once again full for her. The young man began to notice how her mood improved each day. When the dog first ran through the park, her eyes sparkled again, and her tail wagged with happiness. She returned to what had been part of her old life, running, playing, and rejoicing. And although the dog never forgot what she had endured, she understood more and more that there were people who could love and care for her. A spark of faith was reignited in her heart. small but strong enough to light her way. Every day the young man gave her more and more care. He didn't just provide her with food and warmth, but he built a relationship with her. He taught her new tricks, took her on walks, played with her, and paid attention to her. The dog began to trust again. She understood that this person wasn't going to abandon her, that he cared for her not only in moments when she was helpless, but also in moments of joy. This was a new world she was starting to understand and love. A world where there was no room for pain, betrayal, or loneliness. One of the brightest moments for the dog was the day when she first fully trusted the young man. He placed her on the chair, and she peacefully fell asleep next to him, no longer worrying about being left behind. From that moment on, the dog felt that this house had become her real home, a place where she could be happy, where she wouldn't be abandoned or forgotten. With each day, the dog grew more energetic, healthier, and happier. Everything she had gone through hadn't erased the memories, but now she knew that her life was once again full of meaning. Fewer and fewer memories of that cold, empty place where she had been left remained. She no longer felt like an outsider in this world. Now she had an owner who gave her hope and love. Weeks passed, and the dog began to feel like a real part of this world. The young man continued to care for her, making her days meaningful. His love for her was selfless and sincere, and she could feel this in every look, in every gesture. He didn't just save her, he gave her a new life, a new hope, and the understanding that it was possible to be loved, to be needed. The world around her had changed. Winter had gone, and spring had come. Dogs sense changes in nature, and the dog now walked along the street, enjoying the smells of flowers and the warmth of the sun. These simple moments had become real celebrations for her, moments she now appreciated more than ever before. When she looked at the young man, her heart filled with gratitude. He had saved her from death, but he had given her so much more. He had given her a chance at a new life. With each passing day, the dog grew more confident in her new home. She was no longer the confused, frozen dog left on the street who had once lost everything. Now she had a place where she was loved, where she was cared for, where she could live a full life. And although she didn't forget her past, she learned to let go of the pain and open her heart to new love and joy. The dog looked at her new owner, and in her eyes was recognition. She knew that this was her new home, and she was ready to give her loyalty and love to this person who had given her a new chance.